"You'll never dare leave me," Jerry said, his voice low and deliberate, as he placed his coffee mug down on our kitchen counter with calculated precision. It wasn't a threat, at least not the kind that leaves bruises. After 43 years of marriage, Jerry knew better. His weapons were words, silence, and the crushing weight of financial control. I stood there, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the bank statement I'd discovered hidden in his desk drawer. The paper felt impossibly heavy for something so thin. "I'm 68 years old, Jerry. I've spent over 4 decades believing your lies. I won't spend what's left of my life the same way." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, stronger than I felt. "I'm Martha Callahan, and until this morning, I'd been the perfect doctor's wife in Brookhaven, Massachusetts. I'd hosted the hospital fundraisers, volunteered at the church, raised 2 children who'd grown up and moved away, and smiled through countless dinner parties where I was introduced simply as Jerry's wife. I'd swallowed my dreams so slowly, I hardly noticed they were gone." Jerry laughed, not the warm laugh I'd fallen in love with as a young woman, but the dismissive chuckle that had become familiar over the decades. "And where exactly would you go, Martha? Who would take you in? What would you live on?" He gestured around our immaculate kitchen, at the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the marble countertops I'd cleaned just that morning. "This house is in my name. The cars are in my name. Your credit cards are extensions of mine." He was right, of course. I'd discovered that this morning along with the bank statement, a separate account with nearly $1 million I'd known nothing about. Money that should have been ours. Money from the practice I'd helped build by entertaining colleagues, raising our children alone during his residency, moving 3 times for his career. The statement had been mailed to our home by mistake. Usually, they went to a P.O. box I hadn't known existed until today. "And the kids," he continued, watching me carefully. "What would they think of their mother abandoning their father after all these years? Ben's finally making partner at his firm. Do you think he needs this distraction? And Rebecca? Well, she barely speaks to either of us as it is." The mention of our children struck deeper than anything else. Ben, our son, worshipped his father, following in his footsteps with the same driven ambition, the same tendency to see family as something to be managed rather than cherished. Rebecca had escaped to California the moment she finished college, calling dutifully on holidays, but keeping her distance, both physical and emotional. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season. Early November in Massachusetts often brought these tentative snowfalls. Not quite winter, not quite autumn. I'd always loved this time of year, the transition, the promise of holidays. Now, watching the flakes through our kitchen window, I felt trapped, as if the snow was another layer closing in around me. "I found her number too, Jerry." My voice was steady now. "Elaine from the hospital administration. The calls going back 3 years. The hotel receipts." His face changed then, the confident smirk faltering. "Martha, 43 years, I interrupted. "I gave you 43 years. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there. I didn't slam doors or scream. That wasn't who I was, or perhaps it was who I'd been trained to be. The perfect doctor's wife doesn't make scenes. She doesn't air dirty laundry. She smiles and endures. In our bedroom, a room we'd shared but that had never felt like mine, I sat on the edge of the bed. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the heating system. Our home was always the perfect temperature, just like our lives had appeared to be from the outside. Climate-controlled, predictable, sterile. I hadn't cried yet, and the absence of tears worried me. Shouldn't I be devastated? But the truth was, I'd been grieving this marriage for years without naming it. Each time Jerry missed a school play, each dismissive comment about my little hobbies, when I'd tried to take up painting or writing, each evening I'd eaten alone while he worked late, they'd all been small deaths, preparing me for this moment. The phone rang downstairs, and I heard Jerry answer it, his doctor voice, authoritative, reassuring, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just confirmed that my life had been built on shifting sand. I reached for my own phone and dialed a number I rarely used anymore. "Diane? It's Martha. I need help." Diane Weber had been my friend since 7th grade, before I'd ever met Jerry, before I'd become Mrs. Dr. Callahan. We'd drifted apart over the years, my fault, not hers. Jerry had never liked her directness, her independence, the way she asked questions about my life that made me uncomfortable. When she'd moved back to Brookhaven last year after her divorce, I'd seen her only twice, both times for quick coffee dates that left me feeling both energized and unsettled. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said without hesitation. "Pack a bag." After I hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes. Pack a bag. Such a simple instruction, yet it felt monumental. What does one pack when leaving a life behind? I finally stood and pulled my old suitcase from the back of the closet, dusty from disuse, since Jerry always bought new luggage for our carefully planned vacations. I moved methodically, selecting practical items: warm clothes, comfortable shoes, toiletries. My hands paused over the jewelry box on my dresser. Most of the pieces had been gifts from Jerry, markers of anniversaries, birthdays, successful surgeries. I left them all except for my mother's pearl earrings and the simple silver bracelet Diane had given me for my 16th birthday. As I zipped the suitcase, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had my posture become so hunched, my expression so guarded? My silver-streaked hair was neatly styled in the same bob I'd worn for decades, my clothing expensive but unremarkable. Navy slacks, a cashmere sweater in a muted beige. The uniform of invisibility. I heard the doorbell ring, followed by Jerry's voice and then Diane's, sharper, with an edge that made me straighten my spine reflexively. I grabbed my suitcase and coat and made my way downstairs. They stood in the foyer, a tableau of tension. Jerry in his weekend casual wear, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, even at home. Diane in jeans and a vibrant red coat, her gray hair cut in a stylish pixie that highlighted her strong cheekbones. She'd always been beautiful in an unconventional way, comfortable in her own skin in a way I'd secretly envied. "This is ridiculous, Martha," Jerry said when he saw me with the suitcase. "You're overreacting. We can discuss this like adults." "That's exactly what she's doing," Diane replied, before I could speak. "Being an adult who makes her own decisions." "This is between my wife and me," Jerry said, his doctor voice slipping into something colder. "Your wife," I said quietly, "is leaving." The shock on his face was almost worth the terror gripping my chest. In 43 years, I had never defied him so directly. Disagreements had been expressed through subtle suggestions, gentle redirections, careful negotiations, never opposition, never this. "You have nowhere to go," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "She has my guest room for as long as she needs it," Diane said, taking my suitcase from my hand. Her fingers brushed mine, warm and reassuring. "What about your medication?" Jerry tried a different approach, his voice softening with calculated concern. "Your blood pressure, your cholesterol." I reached into my purse and pulled out the small pill organizer I'd packed. "I have enough for 2 weeks. I'm sure I can find another doctor in town who can write refills." The implication that I would choose another physician, another betrayal of sorts, landed visibly. "The neighbors will talk," he said, his final attempt. In Brookhaven, appearance was everything. The prestigious Dr. Callahan, abandoned by his wife of 4 decades? Unthinkable. "Let them," I replied, surprising myself again. I stepped around him and followed Diane to her car, a practical Subaru dusted with the light snow that was now falling steadily. My legs felt wooden, my breathing shallow. Was I really doing this? Leaving the security of my home, my routine, my identity as Mrs. Dr. Callahan? As Diane pulled away from the curb, I looked back at our house, a stately colonial with perfect symmetry, impeccable landscaping, and Christmas lights already professionally installed, but not yet lit for the season. Jerry stood in the doorway, watching us leave, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "He doesn't think I'll stay away," I said, my voice barely audible over the car's heater. "And what do you think?" Diane asked, navigating carefully through the snowy streets. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never done anything like this before." "That's not true," she said, glancing at me briefly. "Remember when we were 17 and you stood up to Mr. Patterson when he said girls shouldn't take advanced physics? You were the only one who challenged him, and then you got the highest grade in the class." I had forgotten that. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost the girl who believed in herself, who didn't hesitate to speak up. That was a different Martha, I said. No, Diane replied firmly. That's the real Martha. You've just been underwater for a long time, but you've surfaced now, and you're going to remember how to breathe. We drove in silence through the town where I'd lived my entire adult life, past the hospital where Jerry had built his reputation while I'd raised our children, past the church where I'd organized countless charity events, past the schools our children had attended where I'd volunteered while Jerry had attended medical conferences. Everything looked different somehow, smaller, less intimidating. By the time we reached Diane's cottage near the harbor, the snow was falling more heavily, transforming the world into something softer, less defined. Like me, I thought, in transition, becoming something new. The guest room is small, Diane said as she helped me with my suitcase, but it has a view of the water. I followed her inside, into warmth and the scent of something savory cooking. Her home was nothing like mine. Smaller, cluttered with books and art, vibrant throws draped over mismatched furniture. It looked lived in, personal in a way my perfectly decorated house had never been. I made soup, she said, taking my coat, and there's fresh bread. You should eat something. I nodded, suddenly aware of how little I'd eaten that day, how little I'd been present in my own body for years. Diane, I said, my voice catching. What have I done? She took my hands in hers, her artist's hands with paint perpetually embedded in the creases despite her best efforts to clean them. You've taken the first step toward saving your life, Martha, and I'm so proud of you. The tears finally came then, not for the marriage I was leaving, but for the years I'd lost, for the woman I might have been if I'd had the courage sooner. Diane held me while I cried, her embrace firm and secure, asking nothing from me but my truth. What happens now? I asked when I could speak again. Now, she said, leading me to her kitchen table where 2 bowls of steaming soup waited. You eat, then you sleep. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out the rest. As we sat together in her warm kitchen, with the snow falling outside and the sound of the harbor bells in the distance, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Not certainty, not happiness, but possibility. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. I didn't know then what the coming days would bring. The calls from Jerry alternating between threats and pleas, the uncomfortable conversations with our children, the whispers in town, the discovery of just how thoroughly Jerry had isolated me from our finances. I didn't know about the lawyer who would help me, or the support group that would become my lifeline, or the friends I would reconnect with who had been waiting for this moment far longer than I had. I knew only that I had finally spoken my truth and the world hadn't ended. That night, in Diane's guest room with its view of the snow-covered harbor, I slept deeply for the first time in years, free from the weight of pretending. Outside, the first winter storm of the season transformed the landscape, covering everything familiar with something new and unmarked, ready for fresh footprints, ready for me to begin again. The first week away from Jerry passed in a fog of emotion and practicality. I moved through Diane's cottage like a ghost, alternating between moments of terrible doubt and startling clarity. My phone vibrated constantly with texts and calls from Jerry, first angry, then pleading, then threatening. After 3 days, I turned it off completely. You'll need to get a new number, Diane said over breakfast on my 8th morning of freedom. She slid a prepaid phone across the table. Use this for now. Only give the number to people you trust. The idea that I needed to hide my contact information from my husband of 43 years should have felt extreme, but Jerry's behavior had escalated quickly. He'd shown up at Diane's house twice, once late at night, pounding on the door and demanding to speak with me. The second time, he'd brought our son Ben, using him as emotional leverage. I'd watched through the curtains as Ben stood awkwardly on Diane's porch, his father's hand gripping his shoulder. At 42, Ben was still seeking his father's approval, still playing the role of dutiful son. I couldn't blame him. I'd played my own role for decades, but I couldn't face either of them that day, couldn't risk being pulled back into the life I was struggling to leave behind. I need to talk to the children properly, I said, turning the prepaid phone over in my hands. They deserve an explanation. On your terms, Diane emphasized, not Jerry's. Later that morning, Frank Weber, Diane's brother and a family lawyer, arrived at the cottage. With his salt-and-pepper beard and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he looked nothing like the sharp-suited attorneys Jerry socialized with. Frank sat at Diane's kitchen table and spread out several folders while she made coffee. "Martha, I've drawn up some initial paperwork, but first we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with financially," he explained. "Based on what you've told me, I'm concerned about the extent to which Jerry has separated and possibly hidden assets." I nodded, a familiar shame washing over me. How had I allowed myself to remain so ignorant about our finances? I'd always signed whatever documents Jerry put in front of me, trusting that he was handling things properly, even when he dismissed my questions with patronizing explanations about how complex financial matters were best left to him. "I don't even know what I don't know," I admitted. Frank's expression softened. "That's why we're here. I see this more often than you might think, especially with couples of your generation. One spouse, usually the wife, is systematically kept in the dark about finances." He pushed a legal pad toward me. "Let's start with what you do know. Properties, bank accounts, investments, insurance policies, anything you can remember even if it seems insignificant." For the next 2 hours, I struggled to piece together the financial framework of my life. Our primary home in Brookhaven, the vacation house on Cape Cod that we visited for 2 weeks each summer, Jerry's medical practice, which I knew he co-owned with 2 other doctors, retirement accounts that were occasionally mentioned but never explained to me, the college funds for the children that had supposedly been depleted years ago. "What about your name on accounts?" Frank asked. "Joint checking? Credit cards?" "I have a checking account for household expenses that Jerry deposits money into monthly," I explained. "And I have credit cards, but I've realized they're all connected to his accounts." Frank made notes, his expression growing more serious. "And your own income? You mentioned teaching piano lessons?" I nodded. "Years ago, before Ben was born, I stopped when Jerry said it wasn't necessary and took too much time away from family responsibilities. The memory stung more now than it had at the time. I'd loved teaching, loved the connection with my students and the independence of earning my own money, however modest the amount. "Did you ever work in Jerry's medical practice? Help with bookkeeping, scheduling, patient relations?" "Not officially," I said. "But I organized all the practice social events, hosted dinners for potential partners, entertained hospital administrators." My voice trailed off as I realized how much unpaid work I'd contributed to building Jerry's career. Frank nodded thoughtfully. "That has value, Martha. In a long-term marriage like yours, the support you provided has concrete worth, even if you weren't on the payroll." By early afternoon, we had assembled a rough outline of my financial situation. The picture wasn't pretty. I had no independent income, minimal savings of my own, and potentially limited access to the marital assets until a divorce settlement was reached, a process Frank warned could be lengthy and contentious if Jerry chose to fight. "What about immediate needs?" Diane asked her brother. "Martha can stay with me as long as necessary, but she'll need money for basics." "We'll file for temporary spousal support right away," Frank assured us. "And given the length of the marriage and the discrepancy in earning power, long-term alimony is virtually certain. Massachusetts law is fairly clear on these matters." After Frank left, promising to begin the formal filing process the next day, I sat by Diane's front window, watching the harbor. The snow from the previous week had mostly melted, leaving everything looking damp and exposed. Like me. "You're thinking about going back, aren't you?" Diane asked quietly, joining me with 2 mugs of tea. I couldn't deny it. The financial reality was terrifying. The emotional toll of starting over at 68 seemed insurmountable in certain moments. "I keep thinking about what Jerry said. Where would I go? What would I live on?" "That's exactly what he wants you to think," Diane said firmly. "He's counting on your fear." "It's not just fear," I admitted. "It's habit. Even now, I keep wondering if he's eaten properly, if he remembered to pick up his prescription, if he's wearing the right tie to his meeting with the hospital board." I gave a hollow laugh. 43 years of being responsible for someone else's life doesn't disappear overnight. "And who was responsible for your life all that time?" Diane asked gently. The question hung in the air between us, unanswerable. That evening, I used the prepaid phone to call Rebecca in California. My daughter answered on the 3rd ring, her voice immediately wary. "Mom, Dad said you've had some kind of breakdown. The words stung, but didn't surprise me. Of course, Jerry would frame my departure as a mental health crisis rather than a response to his betrayal. I haven't had a breakdown, Rebecca, I said as calmly as I could. I've left your father. There's a difference. Silence stretched between us, thousands of miles of it. Why? She finally asked, her voice smaller somehow. After all this time, why now? I hadn't planned to share the details of Jerry's infidelity with our children, had thought I could simply explain that we'd grown apart. But Rebecca deserved the truth, or at least part of it. I found out your father has been lying to me about important things, financial things, and other matters. I couldn't bring myself to say the words affair or other woman to my daughter. I need to figure out who I am apart from him. Another long silence. Is this because of what happened at Christmas? Rebecca finally asked. The question caught me off guard. Last Christmas had been particularly tense, with Rebecca bringing home her new girlfriend, Sophia. Jerry had been coldly polite, but clearly disapproving. I'd tried to mediate, as always, making everyone uncomfortable in the process. This isn't about Christmas, I assured her, though I'm sorry for how that went. I should have been more supportive. You've always taken his side, Rebecca said, an old hurt evident in her voice. With everything. Had I? The accusation felt both unfair and uncomfortably accurate. I'd tried to be the bridge between Jerry and our children, especially as they grew older and began challenging his authority. In trying to keep the peace, had I betrayed my daughter's trust? I'm not taking his side now, I said quietly. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Rebecca promising to call again soon. I wasn't sure if she believed me, or if she was just humoring the mother she thought was having a mental health crisis. Either way, it was more communication than we'd had in months. The call with Ben the next day went even less smoothly. As a corporate attorney in Boston, he had inherited his father's authoritative manner and impatience with emotional displays. This is completely irresponsible, Mom, he said almost immediately. Dad's beside himself. His blood pressure is through the roof. Have you thought about what this is doing to his health? I've thought about very little else for decades, I replied, surprised by the edge in my voice. Your father is a doctor. He knows how to take care of himself. That's not the point. You have obligations. A marriage isn't something you just walk away from because you're going through some senior moment. I almost laughed at that. The dismissive way he categorized my decision as age-related confusion rather than clarity. I appreciate your concern, Ben, but this is between your father and me. He says you've gotten a lawyer, Ben continued, ignoring my statement. Do you have any idea how this will look? Dad's reputation in the community. Is that what you're worried about? I interrupted. Your father's reputation? I'm worried about you, he insisted, though his tone suggested otherwise. Living with Diane Weber, of all people. You know what they say about her in town. I did know. After her divorce, Diane had been the subject of gossip, the woman who'd left her husband for no good reason, who dressed too young for her age, who took art classes in Boston, and occasionally dated men from dating apps. In Brookhaven, these were scandalous acts for a woman in her 60s. Diane is my oldest friend, I said firmly, and I'm grateful for her support. The call ended with Ben promising to fix this mess, as if my life were a legal problem he could solve with the right motion or filing. I set down the phone feeling drained but oddly liberated. For perhaps the first time, I'd spoken to my son as Martha, not as an extension of his father. The next morning brought fresh snow and a letter delivered by courier, not to Diane's address, which Jerry didn't have, but to Frank's office, where I'd scheduled a follow-up appointment. It was from Jerry's lawyer, a coldly formal document outlining the generous terms Jerry was prepared to offer if I returned home immediately and sought appropriate counseling for my emotional disturbance. Frank read it with a deepening frown. This is quite something, he said diplomatically when he finished. Essentially, he's offering to forgive your abandonment if you return and agree to psychiatric evaluation and treatment. As if I'm the one who needs help, I said, a bubble of unexpected laughter rising in my throat. There's more, Frank continued, turning to the second page. If you refuse these terms, he intends to contest any division of assets on the grounds that you've demonstrated mental instability and financial irresponsibility. My laughter died. Can he do that? He can try, Frank said, setting the letter aside. But no judge is going to take this seriously. This is a desperate move, Martha. It tells me he's worried. I wasn't so sure. Jerry had considerable influence in Brookhaven. Friends on the hospital board, former patients in local government, colleagues who owed him favors. Would that influence extend to the legal system? Frank must have read my concern. The law is on your side, he assured me. Massachusetts recognizes the concept of equitable distribution, regardless of who earned the money. Your contributions to the marriage, raising the children, supporting his career, maintaining the home, all have recognized value. I nodded, trying to believe him. On the way back to Diane's, we stopped at the small public library where I'd once volunteered. I needed to check my email on a public computer since I'd left my laptop behind and wasn't ready to purchase a new one yet. As I walked through the familiar doors, I was acutely aware of the glances and whispers from the staff. News traveled fast in Brookhaven. Mrs. Peterson, the head librarian who had once been my close friend, approached with obvious discomfort. "Martha," she said stiffly, "how unexpected to see you." "Hello, Margaret," I replied, forcing a smile. "I just need to use a computer for a moment." "Of course." She hesitated, then added in a lowered voice, "Jerry was here yesterday for the hospital board meeting. He seemed, well, concerned about you." I could imagine exactly what kind of concern Jerry had expressed. "I'm fine, Margaret. Better than I've been in a long time, actually." Her expression was skeptical, but she directed me to an available computer. As I checked my email, mostly messages from concerned acquaintances who'd heard various versions of what Jerry was calling my episode, I felt Margaret's gaze on me from behind the circulation desk. By the time I finished and stood to leave, 2 other women I knew from church had entered the library. They paused when they saw me, exchanging glances before approaching with exaggerated sympathy. "Martha, dear," said Susan Wright, reaching for my hands. "We've been so worried. How are you feeling?" "I'm well, thank you," I said, gently extracting my hands from hers. "Jerry told us at the committee meeting that you're taking some time for yourself," said Helen Barnes, her eyes scanning me as if looking for visible signs of instability. "Just know that we're all praying for your recovery." "That's kind," I replied. "But I'm not ill, Susan. I've left Jerry. We're separating." The blunt statement, so at odds with Brookhaven's culture of polite evasion, landed like a bomb in the quiet library. Susan's mouth actually dropped open while Helen took a small step back as if divorce might be contagious. "But after all these years?" Susan finally managed. "Yes," I said simply. "After all these years." As I walked back to Diane's car, I felt lighter somehow. The truth, spoken aloud in a public place to people who would certainly spread it, had been surprisingly liberating. Jerry could no longer control the narrative if I refused to play along. That evening, Diane suggested we attend a community art class at the local cultural center. "You need to get out," she insisted. "Start reclaiming public spaces. Brookhaven doesn't belong to Jerry." The thought of facing more whispers and stares was exhausting, but I recognized the wisdom in her advice. I couldn't hide forever. The art studio was warm and bright, with large windows overlooking the harbor. 10 easels were arranged in a semicircle, most already occupied when we arrived. I recognized several faces: a former patient of Jerry's, the owner of the local bookstore, a woman from my old garden club. Each registered varying degrees of surprise at seeing me. The instructor, a young woman with vibrant blue hair who had recently moved to town, seemed blissfully unaware of who I was, or the mild sensation my presence was causing. She welcomed everyone warmly and explained that we would be painting seascapes using techniques inspired by Turner. "Don't worry about getting it right," she advised. "Focus on how the scene makes you feel." I hadn't held a paintbrush since a brief period in my 30s when I'd taken art classes at the community college, until Jerry had pointed out that the time and expense weren't justified by my modest talent. Setting brush to canvas now, 40 years later, I felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. For 2 hours, I lost myself in blues and grays and whites, in the rhythm of brush strokes and the scent of paint. My seascape emerged not as a precise representation of the harbor view, but as something stormier, more emotional, waves crashing against rocks beneath a sky heavy with imminent change. That's quite powerful, Martha, the instructor said when she came to check my progress. There's real feeling there. By the end of class, my back ached from sitting on the unfamiliar stool and my fingers were stained with paint. My finished piece was amateurish compared to some of the others, but it was unmistakably mine, perhaps the first thing that had been truly mine in decades. As we gathered our belongings, Ruth Harper, my former neighbor from 2 streets over, approached hesitantly. "I like your painting," she said, gesturing toward my canvas. "It reminds me of that big nor'easter we had back in '98. Remember? When the power was out for 3 days?" I did remember. Jerry had been away at a medical conference, and Ruth and I had combined our perishable food and made impromptu meals for the neighborhood children by candlelight. It was one of the few times I enjoyed a power outage, I admitted. It felt like an adventure. Ruth smiled, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I heard about you and Jerry," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, I think you're brave. Brave. Not crazy or selfish or having a breakdown. Brave." "Thank you," I whispered, unexpected tears pricking my eyes. As we walked back to Diane's cottage through the cold evening air, canvas under my arm, I thought about Ruth's words. Was I brave? Or just desperate? Perhaps the two weren't so different after all. That night, I dreamed of the ocean. Not violent and stormy as I'd painted it, but vast and waiting. In the dream, I stood at the edge of a dock, looking out at endless possibility. When I woke, traces of the feeling lingered, fear mixed with a fragile, growing hope. 2 weeks had passed since I'd walked out of my home. 2 weeks of legal consultations and uncomfortable phone calls, of whispers in public places and sleepless nights, but also 2 weeks of small freedoms, choosing what to eat and when, speaking my mind without calculating the response, reconnecting with the woman I'd been before I became Mrs. Dr. Callahan. I was still afraid, still uncertain about the future, but I was no longer drowning. I had surfaced, as Diane had said that first day, and I was slowly, painfully learning to breathe again. 1 month after leaving Jerry, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Diane's cottage, hardly recognizing myself. My silver-streaked hair, which had been maintained in the same conservative bob for decades, now fell in loose waves around my shoulders. The change wasn't dramatic by most standards. I hadn't dyed it purple or shaved it off, but for me, it represented a small rebellion against the woman I'd been trained to be. "It suits you," Diane said, leaning against the doorframe. "You look more like yourself." "I'm not sure I know what that means anymore," I admitted, turning away from my reflection. The past weeks had been a crash course in rediscovering, or perhaps discovering for the first time, who Martha Callahan might be without Jerry's influence shaping every decision. Simple things had become complicated. What to eat for breakfast, what time to go to bed, whether to watch the nightly news or read a novel instead. For decades, these choices had been dictated by Jerry's preferences or our established routine. Even my wardrobe represented his vision rather than mine. Most of my clothes were in neutral colors: beige, navy, gray, conservative cuts chosen to project the appropriate image of a doctor's wife. Classic, Jerry always called them. Timeless. What he meant was unnoticeable. I'd left most of those clothes behind, bringing only what I needed for immediate practicality. "We should go shopping," Diane suggested, as if reading my thoughts. "You can't keep wearing my sweaters forever, though that blue one does look better on you than it ever did on me." I glanced down at the soft turquoise sweater I'd borrowed, brighter than anything I'd worn in years. I wouldn't know where to start. "That's the beauty of it," Diane replied. "You can start anywhere you want." That afternoon, we drove to a small boutique in a neighboring town where I wouldn't likely run into anyone from Brookhaven. The owner, a stylish woman around my age, greeted us warmly and without the curious looks I'd grown accustomed to receiving at home. "My friend needs a completely fresh start," Diane explained. "Something that reflects who she is now." "Wonderful," the owner said, looking me over with a professional eye. "And who are you now, dear?" The question caught me off guard. Who was I? Not just Jerry's wife, not just Ben and Rebecca's mother, but beyond those negations, I struggled to define myself. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, "but I'd like to find out." The owner nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response. "Then let's experiment a bit, shall we?" For the next hour, I tried on clothes I would never have considered before. Flowing tunics in rich colors, comfortable yet stylish pants with elastic waistbands, a revelation after decades of structured slacks. Soft cardigans that wrapped around me like embraces. No beige, no stiff collars, no uncomfortable shoes chosen for appearance rather than comfort. Standing in the dressing room in a deep purple top that brought out flecks of blue in my eyes I'd never noticed before, I felt a strange mixture of liberation and guilt. These clothes weren't extravagant, nothing compared to the designer labels Jerry had insisted I wear to hospital functions, but spending money on myself still felt forbidden somehow. "I can't afford this," I whispered to Diane when we had a moment alone. "Not until the financial situation is resolved." "My treat," she said firmly. "Consider it 43 late birthday presents." I started to protest, but she cut me off. "Martha, you need to understand something. When Jerry isolated you financially, it wasn't just about money. It was about autonomy, about your right to make choices. So today, choose something just because you like it. Not because it's practical or appropriate or what's expected, just because it brings you joy. Joy." Such a simple word for something that had become so foreign to me. In the end, I left with several new outfits, each one a small declaration of independence. The bags felt impossibly light for the weight of their significance. That evening, as we unloaded the shopping bags in Diane's guest room, which had gradually acquired touches of my personality over the past weeks, my prepaid phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Mom?" Her voice sounded different, less guarded than during our previous conversations. "I've been thinking about what you said, about leaving Dad. I think I understand." I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone. "You do?" "Sophia and I have been talking about it a lot," she continued. "About patterns and how we sometimes don't see them when we're inside them. She says," Rebecca paused, "she says you're brave." That word again. Brave. It still didn't feel true, but hearing it from my daughter, who had spent years maintaining a careful distance from both her parents, loosened something in my chest. "I've booked a flight," Rebecca continued. "I'm coming to see you next weekend. Just me, not Sophia this time. If that's okay?" "Of course it's okay," I said, blinking back tears. "More than okay." After we hung up, I sat motionless, processing the shift in our relationship. Rebecca had chosen to visit me separately from her father without his knowledge or orchestration. It was a first in our adult relationship. The next morning brought a different sort of change. Frank called with news about the financial discovery process. "We've identified several accounts Jerry hadn't disclosed," he explained, including one with substantial deposits coinciding with the sale of his first practice 10 years ago. "Based on these findings, I'm preparing to file for emergency spousal support while we continue building the full financial picture." "What does this mean practically?" I asked, still struggling to understand the legal process. "It means the court can order Jerry to provide financial support immediately, rather than waiting for the final divorce settlement. It also means we have evidence that he's been hiding assets, which strengthens our position significantly." I should have felt vindicated by this news, but instead, I felt a profound sadness. Not for the end of my marriage, that grief was separate and already being processed, but for the reality that the man I'd built a life with had been systematically ensuring I would remain dependent on him. The financial deception represented a deeper betrayal than even the affair. It was calculated, sustained, and designed to keep me trapped. Later that week, I had my first court appearance for the emergency support hearing. Frank had prepared me thoroughly, explaining that these proceedings were typically straightforward, but Jerry's attorney had requested a full hearing, forcing me to testify about my financial situation. The courthouse in downtown Brookhaven was an imposing brick building I'd passed countless times without ever entering. Now, dressed in one of my new outfits, a deep blue dress that made me feel both dignified and authentic, I climbed the steps with Frank beside me, acutely aware of being watched. Brookhaven was small enough that my presence at court would be noted and discussed. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. Jerry and his attorney were already seated at one of the tables at the front. Jerry wore his serious occasion suit, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe, and had gotten a fresh haircut. He looked exactly as he always had, distinguished, authoritative, completely in control. When he turned and saw me, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at my changed appearance. I'd half expected to feel the old pull toward him, the instinct to check if his tie was straight or if he needed anything. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing a familiar character in a play rather than the man who had been the center of my universe for over 4 decades. The hearing itself was both tedious and surreal. Jerry's attorney, a slick Boston lawyer with an aggressive manner, portrayed me as a woman having a late-life crisis, emotionally unstable and making irrational decisions. He emphasized my lack of independent income, my age, and the generous lifestyle Jerry had provided, suggesting that any financial hardship I now faced was entirely self-inflicted by my abandonment of the marriage. When it was my turn to testify, Frank guided me through a series of questions about my contributions to the marriage, my current living situation, and my basic needs. I spoke clearly, meeting the judge's eyes, surprising myself with my own composure. During cross-examination, Jerry's attorney became more pointed. "Mrs. Callahan, isn't it true that your husband offered to welcome you back home with no questions asked? He offered to take me back if I agreed to psychiatric evaluation and treatment," I corrected, "for an illness I don't have. And you've been living with Diane Weber, is that correct? A woman known in the community for her unconventional lifestyle choices?" Frank objected immediately, and the judge sustained it, but the implication was clear. I had fallen under the influence of a bad element, a divorcee who had corrupted my thinking. Throughout the questioning, I kept my eyes away from Jerry, focusing instead on the judge, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than me, with a thoughtful expression and a wedding band worn smooth by decades. When the hearing concluded, the judge took only a brief recess before returning with her decision. "The court finds sufficient basis to award temporary spousal support in the amount of $5,000 monthly, effective immediately," she stated. Additionally, Dr. Callahan is ordered to continue health insurance coverage and to provide Mrs. Callahan with access to the joint checking account that existed prior to their separation. She looked directly at Jerry as she continued. "The court takes a dim view of financial isolation tactics in marriages of this duration. Further attempts to restrict Mrs. Callahan's access to marital assets before final distribution may result in additional penalties." The relief I felt wasn't primarily about the money, though the practical implications were significant. It was about being seen, truly seen, as a person with rights and value, independent of my husband. The judge had cut through Jerry's carefully constructed narrative and recognized the reality beneath. As we left the courtroom, I finally allowed myself to look at Jerry. His face was rigid with anger, his knuckles white where he gripped his briefcase. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen before: uncertainty. For perhaps the first time, Jerry wasn't in complete control of the situation, and he didn't know how to process that reality. Outside the courthouse, a light rain was falling, the kind that seems to blur the edges of everything. Frank offered to drive me back to Diane's, but I asked him to drop me at the small park near the harbor instead. I needed to be alone to process what had happened. The park was deserted in the drizzle, the wooden benches slick with moisture. I sat anyway, opening the umbrella Diane had insisted I take that morning. From this vantage point, I could see most of downtown Brookhaven, the church where I'd taught Sunday school, the community center where I'd organized fundraisers, the shops where proprietors knew me only as Dr. Callahan's wife, a town I'd lived in for most of my adult life, yet had never fully inhabited as myself. Movement caught my eye, a figure approaching along the harbor path. As they drew closer, I recognized Claire Simmons, a woman I knew vaguely from the hospital auxiliary committee. She'd always been friendly, but not particularly close, one of the many acquaintances that populated the periphery of my carefully curated social life. "Martha," she called, hurrying over with her own umbrella. "I thought that was you. Are you all right? You're soaked." I hadn't noticed the rain seeping through my coat, my mind too occupied with the morning's events. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, that's not true. I don't know what I am." Instead of the awkward retreat I expected, Claire sat down beside me on the wet bench. I heard you were in court today, she said simply. Of course she had. Nothing stayed private in Brookhaven. News travels fast, I said with a wry smile. Small towns, she agreed. For what it's worth, not everyone believes Jerry's version of events. I looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? Claire hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I'm part of a support group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. Women in transition, we call ourselves. Divorce, widowhood, empty nest, retirement, any major life change. Several of us have experiences with men like Jerry. Men like Jerry, I repeated slowly. Men who need to control everything, who make you doubt yourself, who isolate you. She paused. I was married to one for 27 years. I studied her with new interest. Claire had always seemed so put together, so confident. I would never have guessed she shared any part of my experience. After the divorce, how did you rebuild? I asked. One day at a time, she said. With help. That's why we started the group. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. Thursday at 7, if you're interested. No pressure. I took the card, turning it over in my fingers. I'll think about it. As Claire walked away, I remained on the bench, rain pattering on my umbrella. The card a small weight in my pocket. Another choice to make, another small step toward whatever I was becoming. Rebecca's visit that weekend was a revelation. She arrived on Friday afternoon, and when I opened Diane's door to greet her, we both hesitated, suddenly awkward with each other. My daughter looked more like me than I usually acknowledged. The same wide-set eyes and determined chin, though her hair was dark like Jerry's had been before it grayed. Your hair, she said, taking in my new style. It looks good. Thank you, I replied, touching it self-consciously. Come in. Diane's out at her art class, so we have the place to ourselves for a while. Rebecca stepped inside, setting down her small overnight bag. It's cozy, she said, looking around the cottage with its mismatched furniture and walls covered with Diane's paintings. So different from the formal, professionally decorated home she'd grown up in. It's not what you're used to, I acknowledged. No, Rebecca agreed, but neither are you. We made tea and sat in Diane's small living room, the harbor visible through the windows. The initial awkwardness slowly gave way to the most honest conversation we'd had in years, perhaps ever. I always thought you were happy, Rebecca said after I'd explained more about my decision to leave. With Dad, with the life you had. I thought I was too, I admitted. Or I convinced myself I was. There's a difference between contentment and resignation. But it took me a long time to understand that. Did you ever want something else? A different life? The question struck at the heart of everything I'd been grappling with. I wanted to teach piano again, I said slowly. I wanted to travel more, not just to medical conferences, where I spent most of the time alone in hotel rooms while your father networked. I hesitated, then continued, I wanted a partnership, equal respect. Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful. When Sophia and I first got together, we talked a lot about what kind of relationship we wanted to build, what patterns we didn't want to repeat from our parents. She looked at me directly. Your marriage with Dad was one of my examples of what I didn't want. The statement hurt, but I couldn't deny its truth. I'm sorry, I said, for modeling that kind of relationship, for not being stronger sooner. Don't apologize, Rebecca said firmly. You're doing it now. That's what matters. Later, as we prepared dinner together, a simple pasta dish I'd learned to make from one of Diane's cookbooks, Rebecca asked about my plans. Will you stay in Brookhaven? After everything is settled, I mean? I paused in chopping basil, considering the question. I don't know, I admitted. I've never lived anywhere else, but now it feels like Jerry's town, not mine. You could move to California? Rebecca suggested casually, though I could hear the hope beneath her words. Lots of retirees in my area. Good weather, progressive community. You might like it. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Leave Massachusetts? Start over completely in a place where no one knew me as Mrs. Dr. Callahan? I'll think about it, I promised. On Sunday morning, before driving Rebecca to the airport, we walked along the harbor. The March air was crisp, but hinted at spring, and the water reflected a sky of perfect blue. We talked about her work, about Sophia, about the possibility of them getting married now that Rebecca's partner was up for a promotion that would bring more financial stability. "I wish Ben understood," Rebecca said as we turned back toward Diane's cottage. "About you leaving Dad. He's completely bought into the story that you're having some kind of breakdown." "Your brother has always idolized your father," I said, "and Jerry has always encouraged that." "Still," Rebecca insisted, "he should support you, at least listen to your side." I squeezed her hand. "He'll come around in his own time, or he won't. I can't make that choice for him." Saying goodbye at the airport was harder than I'd anticipated. We hugged for a long time, and I felt Rebecca's tears against my cheek. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she whispered. "Really proud." Driving back to Brookhaven alone, those words echoed in my mind. My daughter was proud of me, not for being a perfect wife or maintaining a beautiful home or hosting flawless dinner parties, but for finding the courage to claim my own life. Nothing Jerry had ever said to me had meant as much. That Thursday, I found myself standing outside the community center at 6:55 p.m., Claire's card clutched in my hand. Through the windows, I could see a circle of chairs being arranged in one of the meeting rooms, women of various ages helping to set up. I nearly turned away. What did I have in common with these women, beyond the broadest definition of transition? What would I even say? But as I hesitated, the door opened, and Claire stepped out. "Martha," she said warmly, "I was hoping you'd come. First time is the hardest." Before I could respond, another woman emerged behind her, Ruth Harper, my former neighbor who had spoken to me at the art class. "Well, look who's here," Ruth said with a smile. "About time." I recognized several other faces as I entered the room. Women from church, from the garden club, from the hospital auxiliary. Women I'd known for years, but never truly known. Each greeted me with a nod or smile, without the pitying looks or whispered comments I'd grown accustomed to around town. The meeting began simply, with Claire welcoming everyone and explaining the group's purpose for any newcomers. Then, one by one, women shared updates on their situations. A widow who had finally cleaned out her husband's closet after 2 years. A newly divorced mother navigating co-parenting with a difficult ex. A woman in her 70s who had recently moved to assisted living and was struggling with the loss of independence. When it came to my turn, I surprised myself by speaking steadily about the court hearing, about Rebecca's visit, about my uncertainty regarding the future. "I feel like I'm starting from scratch," I concluded, "learning how to be a person outside of my marriage." The women nodded in understanding. No platitudes, no easy solutions offered, just recognition of the journey. After the meeting, several members lingered, chatting over coffee and cookies. Ruth approached me, 2 cups in hand. "You know," she said, passing me one, "I've lived across from you for 15 years, and this is the first time I feel like I'm actually meeting you." "I'm not sure I knew myself well enough before to really meet anyone else," I admitted. Ruth laughed, a surprisingly youthful sound from her 72-year-old frame. "Better late than never, my dear. Better late than never." Walking back to Diane's cottage that evening under a sky full of stars, I felt something shift inside me. Not the ground beneath my feet suddenly solid, but rather my own center of gravity adjusting to a new reality. I was not alone in this journey. There were women who understood, who had walked similar paths, who had rebuilt their lives one difficult choice at a time. For the first time since leaving Jerry, I allowed myself to look beyond the legal proceedings and practical concerns to the more profound question. Who did I want to be now that I could finally choose for myself? I didn't have an answer yet, but I was beginning to trust that I would find one. 6 months after leaving Jerry, I stood in the small apartment I now called my own. Late September sunlight streamed through windows I'd deliberately left uncurtained, illuminating walls painted in soft blue. My choice, not a decorator's, not Jerry's. The space was modest compared to the home I'd left behind. A 1-bedroom unit in a renovated historic building downtown, walking distance to the harbor. What it lacked in square footage, it made up for in character and, more importantly, independence. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier. In the end, Jerry had recognized the inevitability of the legal outcome and agreed to a settlement rather than face further scrutiny of his financial manipulations. I'd received half of our assets, substantially more than he'd initially offered, though Frank suspected still less than my true entitlement. The vacation home on Cape Cod had been sold, the proceeds divided. I'd relinquished any claim to Jerry's medical practice in exchange for a larger portion of our retirement accounts and investments. It was enough. Enough for this apartment, enough for security, enough to begin building a life that belonged to me alone. I adjusted a framed watercolor on the wall, one of my own paintings, completed in the art class I now attended weekly. It wasn't particularly good by objective standards, but it represented hours of focus and joy, and I'd grown to appreciate the beauty in imperfection. My phone chimed with a text message. Rebecca, confirming her flight details for the following week. She and Sophia were coming east to attend what Rebecca had jokingly dubbed my divorce party, though I preferred to think of it as a celebration of new beginnings. My daughter's support had remained steadfast throughout the final months of legal proceedings, her weekly calls a lifeline during the most difficult moments. Ben remained distant, though there had been small signs of thawing. A brief, stilted birthday call, a Christmas card with his family's photo, and a handwritten note. Hope you're doing well. Not forgiveness or understanding, not yet, but an acknowledgement of my continued existence in his life. It was a start. The kitchen timer beeped, pulling me from my thoughts. I was experimenting with baking sourdough bread, a hobby I'd taken up recently, enjoying the tactile process and the satisfaction of creating something nourishing with my own hands. Today's loaf was for the support group potluck, where we'd be welcoming 2 new members. The women's group had become central to my new life. What had begun as a lifeline during crisis had evolved into a community of friends who understood the journey of reinvention at an age when society expected settled predictability. Claire, Ruth, and the others had supported me through the worst days of the divorce process, celebrated each small victory, and gently challenged me when old patterns of self-doubt emerged. As I removed the golden brown loaf from the oven, I thought about how much had changed since that first terrifying day of leaving. The practical aspects were significant. My own bank accounts, my own address, my name restored to Martha Wilson, reclaiming my identity before Jerry. But the internal transformation ran deeper. I had discovered boundaries I never knew I needed and strengths I hadn't recognized. I'd learned to make decisions without seeking approval, to trust my own judgment, to recognize when discomfort signaled growth rather than danger. I'd begun to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, finding unexpected peace in moments of quiet self-companionship. There had been setbacks, of course, days when grief ambushed me, not for Jerry or the marriage itself, but for the decades spent living half a life, for the younger woman whose potential had been slowly suffocated. Moments of paralyzing anxiety about the future, about aging alone, about financial security despite the settlement, painful encounters around town with former friends who had chosen sides, who still viewed my decision as incomprehensible. But for each step back, there had been 2 forward. New friendships formed, new skills developed, new confidence in navigating the world as myself rather than as an extension of someone else. The doorbell rang as I was wrapping the bread in a clean kitchen towel. Diana stood outside, arms full of grocery bags. "Final supplies for tomorrow," she announced, breezing past me into the kitchen. "The liquor store had that champagne you liked at Ruth's birthday, so I got extra. Tomorrow. The party. My party." The idea still felt surreal. It had been Claire's suggestion initially, during a support group meeting when I'd mentioned that the divorce was nearly final. "You should mark the occasion," she'd said. "Rituals help us process transitions." What had begun as a small gathering had evolved into something larger, not just the support group women, but others who had become part of my new life. My piano students, 3 local children, and 2 adults I'd begun teaching when I'd finally returned to the passion Jerry had dismissed as impractical. The young art instructor who'd encouraged my clumsy first attempts at painting. The librarian from the community center who had helped me research community college courses for the spring semester. "Is it ridiculous?" I asked Diane as she unpacked the groceries. "Celebrating a divorce at my age?" "You're not celebrating the divorce," she corrected, arranging cheese on a platter and covering it with plastic wrap. "You're celebrating your life, the one you've built for yourself against considerable odds." Later that evening, as final preparations were completed and Diane had gone home, I sat on my small balcony, overlooking the now quiet street. The brick buildings glowed amber in the setting sun, and autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalk below. I'd come to love this view, so different from the manicured lawn and privacy hedges of the house I'd shared with Jerry. My phone rang. Rebecca again, this time with a video call request. I answered to find both her and Sophia crowded into the frame, their apartment visible in the background. "Mom! We're packed and ready for Wednesday," Rebecca announced. "Sophia found the perfect gift for your party." "You didn't need to bring anything," I protested. "Of course we did," Sophia replied. "It's a celebration." As we chatted, I noticed a new easiness between us. Rebecca had always been guarded with me, careful about what she shared of her life. Now she spoke freely about work challenges, their plans to adopt a dog, the possibility of Sophia proposing by Christmas. I was being allowed into their lives in a way I'd never experienced before. "Have you heard from Ben?" Rebecca asked eventually, the question she always approached carefully. "He sent a text last week," I said. "Nothing about the party, but he asked about my piano students. It's something." Rebecca nodded, understanding the significance of even this small communication. "Give him time." After we hung up, I remained on the balcony until stars appeared in the darkening sky. I thought about time, how I'd given decades of it to a marriage that had slowly diminished me, how precious the years ahead now seemed, how differently I valued each day now that it truly belonged to me. The morning of the party dawned clear and crisp, a perfect New England autumn day. I woke early, a lifetime habit I hadn't tried to break. But instead of immediately beginning the household tasks that had structured my days with Jerry, I took my coffee back to bed, savoring the luxury of unhurried solitude. By noon, Diane had arrived to help with final arrangements, transforming my modest apartment with flowers and candles. Claire and Ruth followed, bringing additional food and their easy companionship. The nervous energy I'd felt earlier dissolved in their presence, replaced by anticipation. "Have you thought about what you'll say?" Claire asked as we arranged cheese and fruit on platters. "People might expect a little speech." I hadn't considered this. The thought of standing before a room of people, claiming attention for myself, would have been unthinkable a year ago. Even now, it triggered a flutter of anxiety. "Just speak from your heart," Ruth advised, noting my expression. "No one's expecting poetry." By 4 o'clock, the apartment was filled with conversations and laughter. Rebecca and Sophia had arrived directly from the airport, bringing West Coast sunshine in their smiles and easy affection. My piano students and their parents came bearing handmade cards. Members of the art class brought a collaborative painting they'd created for my new home. Even Mrs. Peterson from the library had come, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine warmth as the afternoon progressed. I moved through my own party in a state of wonder, accepting congratulations and good wishes, introducing people from different corners of my new life to each other, watching connections form that had nothing to do with Jerry or his influence. This gathering, these people, belonged wholly to Martha Wilson. As the celebration reached its peak, Diane clinked a spoon against her glass, calling for attention. "A toast," she announced, "to our guest of honor, to Martha." All eyes turned to me, expectant. The moment Claire had warned me about had arrived. I took a deep breath and stepped into the center of my living room. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here, in my own place, surrounded by such wonderful friends. I paused, searching for words that could convey the complexity of the journey. Someone recently asked what I was celebrating today. It's not the end of my marriage, though that chapter is closed. It's not even really a new beginning, though there have been many of those. I looked around the room, at the faces of people who had supported me, challenged me, helped me rediscover myself. I think what we're celebrating is possibility. The possibility that it's never too late to change your story, never too late to find your voice, never too late to choose yourself. My eyes found Rebecca's, saw the tears there matching my own. I spent decades believing I was too old, too set in my ways, too afraid to make a change. I was wrong. Diane raised her glass higher. "To Martha, and to possibility." "To possibility," the room echoed. As glasses clinked and conversation resumed, I felt a light touch on my arm. Ruth stood beside me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Beautifully said," she murmured. and true for all of us in different ways. The party continued as afternoon faded to evening. People began to depart with warm hugs and promises to call soon. I stood at the door, thanking each guest, still somewhat amazed that this celebration of my life had brought together such a diverse group. As the final guests were leaving, the doorbell rang once more. I opened it, expecting perhaps a forgotten item being returned. Ben stood in the hallway, his tall frame rigid with tension, a small gift bag clutched in one hand. "I hope I'm not too late," he said formally, as if addressing a stranger. "For the party." For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't process the sight of my son standing at my door after months of minimal contact. "No," I finally managed. "Not too late at all. Please, come in." He stepped inside, taking in the remnants of the celebration, the flowers, the half-empty platters, Rebecca and Sophia clearing glasses in the kitchen. His expression was unreadable. "Ben?" Rebecca called, spotting him from the kitchen doorway. "You came!" He nodded stiffly. "I wasn't sure if I should." "I'm glad you did," I said softly. We stood in awkward silence until Ben thrust the small gift bag toward me. "This is for you. It's not much." Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. Ben, at about age 7, sitting at the old piano in our former home, my hands visible beside his on the keys, both our faces captured in a moment of shared concentration and joy. "I found it when I was going through some old albums," he explained. "I'd forgotten you used to teach me." "Every Thursday afternoon," I said, memories flooding back, "until your father decided you should focus on sports instead." Ben's expression shifted slightly. "I think I wanted to keep playing." "So did I admitted. It wasn't a reconciliation. Not yet. But as I placed the photograph on my mantel, I recognized it for what it was, an acknowledgement of a connection separate from Jerry, a memory that belonged just to Ben and me. As the evening wound down, Rebecca and Sophia helped with final cleanup before returning to their hotel. Ben had stayed for only 30 minutes, but had agreed to coffee the next day, a small step toward rebuilding our relationship. Diane was the last to leave, embracing me tightly at the door. "Proud of you," she whispered. "Always have been." Alone again, I moved through my apartment, extinguishing candles, straightening cushions, savoring the lingering energy of celebration. On the mantel, Ben's photograph caught the last light of the day, that moment of connection preserved across decades. I thought about Jerry, wondering if he knew about the party, what he would think of this public celebration of the end of our marriage. 6 months ago, that consideration would have dominated my thoughts, anxiety about his reaction overriding my own feelings. Now it was merely a passing curiosity, no more significant than wondering about tomorrow's weather. My life was my own now, its pleasures and challenges, its friendships and purposes, its past and future. At 68, I had discovered that it was indeed never too late to rewrite your story, to find your voice, to throw yourself a party celebrating the courage to say enough and the wisdom to recognize your own worth. Outside my window, stars appeared in the deepening twilight. Inside, in the home I had created for myself, I stood in the center of possibility, no longer afraid of what came next. If you've ever felt trapped in a life that no longer serves you, remember that it's never too late to choose yourself. Thank you for sharing my journey with me. If you want to hear more stories of women finding their strength later in life, subscribe to my channel and join our growing community.